Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're tuning in, you're probably someone who likes to look past the surface level headlines.
Right.
You want to understand the architecture behind how people think, how laws are formed, and how history is actually preserved.
And today's topic really hits all of those points.
It really does. Today, our mission is to take a massive, highly detailed stack of academic and theological research and extract the core insights just for you. We're looking at an exhaustive analysis exploring 100 critical, taboo, and controversial questions surrounding a text called Sahih Muslim.
Which is, it really is a monumental piece of literature. Compiled over 1,000 years ago, Sahih Muslim is considered one of the two most authentic and foundational books in Sunni Islam.
Yeah.
For a massive portion of the global population, this isn't just a historical document, it's a bedrock text that actively shapes jurisprudence, daily practices, and overarching theology for, over 1 billion people today.
Now, before we jump in, we need to issue a very clear, crucial impartiality disclaimer to you.
Yes, very important.
The source material we're unpacking today covers incredibly intense religious, sectarian, historical, and political debates. Our job here is absolute neutrality.
Completely neutral.
We are not taking any sides. We aren't endorsing any theological viewpoint, nor are we validating any specific critical or secular takedown. Our sole purpose today is to impartially map out the critiques and the scholarly defenses exactly as they're presented in the research material.
Exactly. We're acting purely as your guides through a very complex, often highly charged academic landscape. We're looking at what the critics say and what the traditional and modern scholars say in response. Nothing more, nothing less.
So imagine this scenario. You're compiling 300,000 historical reports and filtering all of that down to just a few thousand core texts.
It's a massive undertaking.
And you use this to create the source code for an entire civilization's legal and cultural framework.
Yeah.
And then for the next 1,100 years, every single word you selected is scrutinized.
Picked apart by everyone.
Right, picked apart by rival sects, by 19th century Orientalists, by modern scientists, and by contemporary human rights academics. That is the story of Sahih Muslim. Okay, let's unpack this. Who was Imam Muslim and what was the actual methodology behind this book? Because we know what a hadith is, but the sheer logistics of this compilation are staggering.
They really are. Imam Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj lived from 815 to 875 CE. He was a scholar from Nishapur, which is in present-day Iran, and he spent 15 years of his life traveling extensively throughout the Islamic world.
Like where?
Places like Iraq, the Hijaz, Syria, Egypt. He was on a singular mission to collect and relentlessly verify the historical record of the Prophet Muhammad. And the scale is just mind-boggling. As you mentioned, he sifted through some 300,000 narrations.
Wow.
From that massive mountain of data, he selected roughly 3,000 unique hadiths. That comes to about 7,500 if you include the various repetitions and alternate chains of transmission.
It's essentially the ultimate ancient data sorting project. And you have to remember the context here. Imagine trying to compile a massive peer-reviewed database today, but instead of using a search engine or a digital library, your only method is walking or riding 500 miles across a desert.
Just to ask a guy in Syria if he remembers a specific quote correctly from his teacher.
Exactly. And he didn't just pick his favorites. The sources detail this incredibly strict 3-tier classification system he used for the narrators.
Right. He prioritized a concept known as itqan, which translates roughly to absolute integrity and precision. His first tier was reserved exclusively for narrators with virtually flawless memory and extensive documented contact with their teachers.
The gold standard.
The gold standard.
Oh.
Then the second tier was for upright individuals with strong memories, but perhaps slightly less extensive contact. Maybe they didn't study under the teacher for quite as many years. And he completely excluded the third tier.
Which consisted of anyone with known moral defects, right? Or political radicalism, or just a poor memory. Only the absolute most reliable data points made the final cut.
Exactly.
Now, whenever Sahih Muslim comes up in academic circles, it's almost always compared to the other giant in the field, Sahih al-Bukhari. And Imam Bukhari was actually the Muslims' teacher, right?
He was, yeah. But they had a very famous difference in their methodology, specifically regarding how they verified the chain of transmission.
What's fascinating here is how they each defined a connected chain. Imagine you have person A narrating a historical event to person B. Imam Bukhari was notoriously incredibly strict. He required definitive historical proof of a physical meeting between the two narrators.
You wanted the receipt.
Exactly. Imam Muslim, however, utilized what's called the contemporaneity rule, or muwasata. He argued that if two highly reliable narrators lived at the exact same time in the same general era and a physical meeting was logically possible, the chain should be considered connected. Unless, of course, there is definitive proof they never met.
So Muslim was a bit more pragmatic about the historical record. He acknowledged that we might not have a receipt for every single meeting, while still maintaining incredibly high standards for the individuals themselves.
But where the sources say Muslim really shined was his organizational genius.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Bukhari scattered his hadiths across different legal chapters, depending on the specific ruling he wanted to highlight. But Muslim approached it more like a modern database architect. He grouped all the variations, the turuk of a single report, in one centralized place.
That structural choice is what makes Sahih Muslim a masterpiece of systematic arrangement. By putting all the varying chains and the slightly different wordings of a hadith right next to each other, he allowed future scholars to easily observe the subtle differences that might actually affect a legal ruling. It was an incredibly transparent way to present the data.
So why should you, listening to this today, care about a 9th century methodology? Because understanding how to verify information, which is exactly what Imam Muslim was doing, is a hyper-relevant skill. He was building an analog ledger of verification.
But, of course, when you build a system this massive, people are going to stress test it.
Oh yeah, and that internal academic scrutiny started almost immediately. For example, in the 10th century, a master critic named Imam al-Daraqutni authored a work where he flagged roughly 100 narrations in Sahih Muslim for technical flaws.
Yes, al-Daraqutni was essentially auditing the auditor. He was looking at Muslim's work and pointing out areas where he felt the methodology wasn't perfectly applied.
Right, and one of the main things he flagged was this concept called anana. Our sources define this as a transmission that is slightly ambiguous. It's when a narrator just says, "on the authority of," rather than explicitly stating, "I directly heard from."
It leaves a tiny bit of doubt.
Exactly. Al-Darqutni flagged anana because if a narrator just says, "on the authority of," it creates a loophole. It doesn't definitively prove they were in the same room. It leaves a micro crack in the chain. And al-Darqutni was pointing out that Muslims' own gold standard rules shouldn't allow for those micro cracks.
It's a highly technical, almost forensic critique. But the scholarly defense against al-Daraqutni is brilliant in its own right. The defenders point out that Imam Muslim didn't use these flawed or ambiguous narrators as his core evidence.
What they call the askel.
Right, the asl. Instead, he utilized them merely as corroborating backups, known as mutabayat.
So, if he already had a rock-solid, airtight chain proving a hadith, he might include a slightly weaker chain alongside it, just to show the breadth of how widely the report was circulating. The core legal ruling was never actually dependent on the weaker chain.
Precisely. It was about showing the total footprint of the data, without relying on the weakest links to support the actual structure.
That handles the internal technical debate, but the sources also dive deep into the sectarian battlegrounds. The most obvious one being the Sunni versus Shia divide. Because while Sunnis view this text as foundational, Shia scholars largely reject it entirely.
They generally do. The Shia critique isn't necessarily about the technical chain structure, it's heavily centered on the narrators themselves. They argue that Sahih Muslim relies heavily on individuals they deem politically biased toward the Umayyad dynasty.
And historically, the Umayyads were the bitter rivals of the Prophet's family, the Al-Bayt.
Exactly. So, from the Shia perspective, the database is fundamentally corrupted by political bias.
A huge point of contention highlighted in our sources is the narrator Abu Huraira. The critique points out that he narrated thousands of hadiths, far more than almost anyone else, yet he only spent about 3 years with the Prophet. To critics, that volume of memorization in such a short window seems functionally impossible.
And that is a very common, very loud critique. But the Sunni defense outlines a highly specific historical and sociological context.
Yeah, I was actually looking closely at the Sunni defense regarding Abu Huraira in our stack, and what fascinated me was the sociological aspect of it. They point out he essentially lived in the mosque, entirely dedicated to something called the Sufa. He had no day job, no family to tend to at the time, no trade in the markets. It was basically a 247 immersive fellowship program for learning. When you view it through that lens, someone shadowing a figure all day, every day, specifically to memorize their words, the sheer volume of his memory makes a lot more logical sense than comparing him to someone who only visited the mosque occasionally.
That's exactly the traditional argument. Furthermore, traditionalists defend the text against the charge of anti-family bias by pointing out that Sahih Muslim actually contains numerous hadiths deeply praising the al-Bayt. It includes the famous hadith of the cloak, which elevates the status of the Prophet's family. So defenders argue it isn't a purely anti-family political document, otherwise those narrations would have been scrubbed by an Umayyad-biased compiler.
Then you have the Western academic and modernist challenges. Scholars like Ignaz Goldziher and Joseph Schacht came along in the 19th and 20th centuries and essentially threw a grenade into the whole system.
They really did.
They argued that the entire isnad system, the chain of transmission itself, is a later fiction. They claimed these hadiths were essentially back-projected. The argument is that 8th and 9th century scholars were having political and legal debates, and to win those debates, they just fabricated quotes and invented chains going back to the Prophet to give their arguments authority.
But the academic pushback to Goldziher and Schacht is quite robust today. Modern scholars utilizing a complex method called isnad-kamat analysis,
Which means analyzing both the geographical spread of the chain and the textual variations simultaneously, right?
Yes, exactly. They've proven that many of these hadiths do, in fact, trace back definitively to early 7th century origins. It's practically impossible to coordinate a massive geographical forgery across different continents without the variations giving away the lie.
And on another flank entirely, you have the modern Quranist movement, arguing that the Quran alone is sufficient, rendering hadith collections entirely unnecessary. I found the traditional counter-argument to this really interesting because it relies on a logical loop. Defenders point out that the Quran itself explicitly and repeatedly commands obedience to the Prophet.
Right.
They argue that fulfilling that specific divine command is functionally impossible without a meticulously preserved record of what the Prophet actually said and did. If you throw out the hadith, you can't actually practice the Quranic injunctions.
This raises an important question, though. It's one thing to defend the historical transmission of a text. It's an entirely different challenge to defend the actual content of that text against modern sensibilities.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because our source material doesn't shy away from the taboos. How does a 9th century text survive the scrutiny of 21st century science, rationalism, and modern human rights?
It's a huge point of friction.
Let's look at the scientific challenges first. For instance, Hadith 159 in the collection says that the sun prostrates under God's throne. Critics immediately flag this, saying, well, that explicitly contradicts heliocentrism. We know the Earth orbits the sun doesn't go anywhere to prostrate.
This is where the concept of tawil, or metaphorical interpretation, becomes absolutely essential in Islamic scholarship. Defenders argue this hadith is describing a metaphysical reality of the unseen, which is called the ghaib.
So it's not meant to be a physics lesson.
No, not at all. The prostration denotes a universal, continuous submission to divine law, not physical planetary mechanics. It's a spiritual description of reality, meant to convey a theological point, not a 7th century astronomy textbook.
Which makes sense. We use metaphors all the time to describe realities that are beyond literal phrasing. But it's much harder to use metaphor when dealing with biology or medicine. There is a hadith that plainly states, no infection. Obviously, that clashes violently with modern germ theory.
It seems like a direct contradiction.
But the scholars clarify the context. The Prophet was negating the pre-Islamic pagan theology that diseases are autonomous deities, acting independently, with their own power, separate from God. He wasn't denying the biological reality of contagion, and the proof they offer from within the very same collection is that the Prophet also commands people to flee from the leper and enact quarantines during plagues.
Right. It's about correcting the underlying theology of causation, asserting that God is the ultimate cause while fully acknowledging the biological mechanism.
And we absolutely have to mention the highly controversial fly wing hadith. It says if a fly falls in your drink, dip it completely in, because there is disease in one wing and a cure in the other.
This one gets brought up a lot.
Critics point to this as peak absurdity, but our sources note a really fascinating defense. Some modern studies have identified bacteriophages, which are viruses that specifically target and kill bacteria living on the surface of certain flies.
It's a perfect example of how a text is continuously reevaluated. What seemed like a complete scientific impossibility 50 years ago is suddenly viewed through the lens of modern entomology and microbiology as strangely prescient. The debate shifts from, this is absurd, to, is this specific scientific phenomenon what the text was actually referring to?
Exactly. But it's one thing to argue about planetary motion or bacteriophages, where science might evolve or metaphors can bridge the gap. It's much, much harder when dealing with human lives, ethics, and social laws.
That is the sharpest edge of the modern critique.
That brings us to the hardest section of our sources, gender and modern taboos. There's a well-known hadith describing women as deficient in intellect and religion. To a modern ear, there's no way around it. That sounds incredibly misogynistic.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of 7th century sociology and Islamic law, the defense relies heavily on deep contextualization. Scholars explain that deficiency in religion is a terrible English translation of a very specific legal ritual categorization.
Yes.
It refers simply to the ritual exemption from prayer and fasting that is granted to women during menstruation. It is a temporary pause in ritual obligation, absolutely not a measure of spiritual worth or religious devotion.
And the deficiency in intellect part, because that's the one that really trips people up.
Again, defenders argue this refers to the specific evidentiary requirements in 7th century Islamic financial testimony, where in certain very specific commercial contracts, a woman's testimony was weighed differently than a man's due to the sociological realities of commerce at that time. Traditional scholars vehemently argue it is a legal reference to testimony, not an ontological claim about female intelligence or brain capacity. Translating it bluntly as deficient in intellect strips away all the legal nuance and leaves a completely skewed modern understanding.
The sources also tackle some genuinely shocking taboos, like adult breastfeeding. There's a hadith discussing this, and it obviously raises massive ethical and cultural red flags for modern readers.
Yes, and the traditional defense here is virtually unanimous among scholars. They view this as a highly specific one-time exception granted to a single individual family, a woman named Salah bint Suhail.
So it wasn't a general rule.
No, not at all. It was a unique domestic crisis occurring during a very tense transition period when pre-Islamic adoption laws were being abruptly abolished. It was a localized solution for one household, never intended by the Prophet to be extrapolated into a universal general law for all Muslims.
And then there is perhaps the most heavily critiqued issue of all in the modern era, the age of Aisha at the time of her marriage to the Prophet, which modern human rights frameworks universally view as child marriage. The traditional defense notes that 7th century Arabia, like much of the ancient world, defined adulthood by puberty and social readiness, not by a universal chronological age like 18. But our sources also drop a genuinely fascinating nugget from modern academia that flips this entirely on its head.
You're referring to the recent research regarding the chronological age report itself?
Exactly. Recent research out of Oxford University by a scholar named Joshua Little suggests that the specific hadith detailing her chronological age as a child might actually be an 8th century sectarian fabrication originating in Iraq long after the fact. It's an ongoing, highly dynamic area of historical research, which shows that the critical conversation around these texts isn't just about interpretation, it's still actively investigating the historical data itself.
This raises an important question about how the text as a whole is protected. With all these 100 critical questions coming from historians, scientists, and ethicists, how do Islamic scholars actually maintain the overarching authority of Sahih Muslim today?
So what does this all mean? When the dust settles, how does the scholarly armor actually hold up?
Traditional scholars, dating back to figures like Al-Nawawi in the 13th century, right up to modern defenders, utilize a three-pronged defense mechanism to protect the text. First, there is not analysis. This is the rigorous, continuous verification of the unbroken chain of human memory. They are constantly testing the historical links to ensure the text hasn't been corrupted.
Which brings us back to that idea of a ledger. We live in an era of digital misinformation, deepfakes, and fake news. We constantly struggle to verify the source of our information. Think about the Isnad. It was essentially an analog 9th century version of blockchain technology. It was a decentralized, meticulously cross-referenced ledger relying on verified human character to protect the truth from forgery.
That's a great analogy. And the second prong of their armor is matin analysis, which is looking deeply at the text's content itself. This involves understanding the deep linguistic nuance of 7th century Arabic. A single ancient Arabic word might have 5 to 10 different meanings depending on the context. Defenders point out that modern critics often deliberately pick the one meaning that creates a conflict rather than the one that harmonizes with the rest of the text.
And the third prong is sabab al-wud, which translates to the historical context, or the reason the text was spoken. This is the critical practice of distinguishing between universal, eternal laws meant for all time and specific, situational rulings. It's like looking at a 1940s wartime rationing law that says you can only buy one loaf of bread and thinking it's a universal, eternal dietary rule for 2026. Without sabab al-wud, you are reading a localized emergency measure or a specific domestic dispute as an eternal mandate, which distorts the entire religion.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the fundamental core philosophy driving the defense of Sahih Muslim is the belief that authentic revelation, which is why, and sound reason, which is alawal, absolutely cannot contradict one another. They are both seen as coming from the exact same divine source.
So there appears to be a contradiction between a verified hadith and modern science or reason. The scholars conclude one of two things. Either human understanding and current scientific observation are currently limited, like with the bacteriophages, and will eventually catch up to the text. Or the text is meant to be understood metaphorically, not literally.
Exactly. To the scholars who defend it, the system of hadith preservation is inherently self-correcting and philosophically sound. The text doesn't break under scrutiny, it just requires a more sophisticated lens to read it properly.
So to wrap up today's deep dive, we've taken a massive journey through how Sahih Muslim was meticulously built from hundreds of thousands of disparate reports into a highly organized, database-like masterpiece. We've seen how it handles intense internal technical critiques about transmission microcracks, how it navigates the deep sectarian divides, and how it faces the incredibly sharp edge of modern scientific, rational, and ethical scrutiny. It is a text that critics see as fraught with human error, political bias, and outdated norms, but which traditional scholars view as a divinely protected, highly sophisticated system of historical preservation.
And as we close, I want to leave you with something to ponder, building on that idea of the verification ledger we discussed earlier. As you navigate today's overwhelming flood of information where a video can be faked in seconds and headlines are designed to manipulate, ask yourself, what is the isnad, the chain of verification for the things you believe to be true today? How rigorous is your own methodology for accepting a piece of data as absolute truth?